Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out here, in the vast and unforgiving lands of the American West, a man's fortune is most often measured by the sweat of his brow and the love of his family. But sometimes, history lies buried just beneath the surface, a sleeping monster waiting for the blade of a plow to wake it. Tonight's story is about a simple farmer who unearthed a relic of a bloody past, and in doing so, was forced to sow a future in gunpowder and grit. This is the story of John Carter, and the cursed steel that changed his world, a tale we call The Serpent in the Soil. The peace of Serenity Valley was a quiet, sacred thing. It was a place the frantic, gold-fevered rush of the world had seemingly forgotten, a lush green bowl carved out by a patient river and ringed by the protective granite shoulders of the Redemption Mountains. The air here didn't taste of coal smoke or trail dust, it tasted of rich, dark earth, of pine needles warming in the sun, and of the sweet promise of rain in the afternoon clouds. This valley was a sanctuary, a place where a man could plant a seed and watch it grow, in the soil and in his own family. John Carter was such a man. He was not a figure of legend. His hands were not calloused from the grip of a pistol, but from the handles of a plow and the rough timber of a barn he had raised with his own two hands. He was a man of medium height and sturdy build, his face brown and lined by the sun, his eyes the clear, steady blue of the prairie sky. His strength was not the explosive, violent power of a gunslinger, but the quiet, enduring force of a farmer, a strength born of persistence, of waking before the sun and working until long after it had set. His world, his entire universe, was encompassed by the neat, split-rail fences of his homestead. His universe had a son, and her name was Mary. She was a woman of the same prairie stock, her spirit as resilient and as vital as the wild flowers that bloomed on the valley floor. Her hands were as capable of binding a wound or calming a frightened calf as they were of baking the bread that was the heart of their home. Her laughter was the melody of John's life, a sound that made the hardest work feel light. Their world had a future, and his name was Daniel. At 7 years old, he was a whirlwind of untamed energy, with his father's steady gaze and a mop of unruly brown hair. He was a child of the valley, his days filled with the monumental adventures of chasing grasshoppers, fishing for minnows in the creek, and learning the names of the constellations from his father in the vast, star-dusted theater of the night sky. This particular morning was like 1,000 others, a perfect and unremarkable jewel. John was in the north pasture, a piece of virgin land he was breaking for the first time. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. His big draft horse, Samson, strained against the harness, the single-blade plow behind him biting deep, turning over the rich, black soil in a long, perfect furrow. It was honest, soul-satisfying work. It was a prayer said with sweat and muscle. It was just before noon when the prayer was answered by a curse. The plow, which had been slicing smoothly through the earth, lurched to a sudden, jarring halt. The blade screamed as it scraped against something hard and yielding. John, thrown forward by the sudden stop, soothed the startled horse before walking back to investigate. He expected a rock, one of the stubborn, granite teeth of the mountain that sometimes worked its way to the surface. He dug around the plow blade with his hands, the cool soil familiar comfort. But what his fingers found was not the rough, rounded shape of a stone. It was flat, and naturally so, and it was wrapped in some kind of rotting, oil-soaked canvas. Curiosity piqued. He worked the object free from the earth's grip. It was a long, heavy bundle, about the size of a man's forearm. He carried it to the shade of a lone cottonwood tree and, using his field knife, carefully cut away the layers of decaying canvas and oilcloth. They peeled away to reveal a long leather holster, its surface cracked and stiff with age, but the intricate tooling, a pattern of intertwining serpents, was still visible. A cold, unfamiliar prickle of unease traced its way down John's spine. This was not the tool of a farmer. His hands, hesitant now, unfastened the leather strap. He drew the pistol from its ancient sheath. It was a Colt Peacemaker, but unlike any he had ever seen. The steel of the barrel and cylinder was a flat, non-reflective black, as if it had absorbed all the light it had ever seen and given none of it back. It felt unnaturally heavy, and naturally cold, even in the warmth of the day. But it was the grips that held his attention. They were not made of wood or bone. They were fashioned from two slabs of polished, jet-black stone that could only be obsidian, a rock not found anywhere in these mountains. Etched into the obsidian of the right-hand grip, in a delicate, silver inlay, was a single, coiled serpent, its head reared as if to strike. John was not a man given to flights of fancy, but as he held the gun, he felt a palpable sense of malice radiating from it, a cold, ancient hunger that had been dormant for a long, long time. He checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded. The brass cartridges were green with age, but they looked intact, deadly. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to throw the thing in the river, to bury it again and never speak of it. But he was also a practical man. A gun like this, as old and unique as it was, could be worth something, perhaps enough to buy the new bull he and Mary had been saving for. That evening, after a dinner where he found himself strangely quiet, he showed it to Mary. She recoiled as if from a live snake. "John, what is that?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper, her eyes wide with a superstitious fear. "I found it," he said, "in the north pasture." The plow turned it up. "It's evil," she said, her voice firm. "I can feel it. It doesn't belong here. It doesn't belong in our home. Get rid of it." "It might be valuable, Mary," he argued, though his heart wasn't in it. Her fear resonated with his own deep-seated unease. "I'll take it into Prosperity tomorrow. I'll show it to Sheriff Brody. He'll know what it is." The town of Prosperity was a 2-hour ride from the valley, a bustling, noisy hub of commerce that always made John feel a bit out of place. Sheriff Brody was a man well past his prime, with a kind, wrinkled face and a deep knowledge of the territory's long and bloody history. He ran a quiet, orderly town, and his office smelled of old paper and stale coffee. John unwrapped the pistol and laid it on the sheriff's desk. Brody's friendly expression vanished. He stared at the gun, his face paling, as if John had just laid a coiled rattlesnake between them. "Great God Almighty," Brody breathed, not as a curse, but as a prayer. He didn't touch the gun. He just stared at it. "Where did you find this?" "My plow turned it up." "On my land," John said. "Do you know what it is?" "I know what it is," Brody said, his voice grim. He finally reached out a trembling hand and tapped the serpent inlay with his finger. This was his mark. They called this gun the Serpent's Tooth. It belonged to Silas Blackwood. The name meant nothing to John, but he could see the weight it carried in the old sheriff's eyes. "Silas Blackwood," Brody continued, his voice low, as if afraid of summoning a ghost, was the leader of the Blackwood marauders. They weren't just outlaws, son. They were a plague. 20 years ago, they tore this territory apart. They were after land, gold, power. They didn't just rob you, they burned you out, salted your fields, and took everything. And Silas was the devil himself. They said he was a sorcerer, that he could kill a man just by looking at him. This gun was his scepter. It was a symbol of his power, a symbol of death. "What happened to them?" John asked, the cold feeling returning to his gut. "They just disappeared," Brody said. "After the big shootout at Red Creek Pass, where they wiped out the last of the big ranchers who stood against them, they vanished. Some say they rode down to Mexico with their fortune. Others say they turned on each other. No one ever knew for sure. But this," he looked at the gun again, "this changes things. This proves he was here, in your valley." A portly, red-faced deputy had entered the office during the conversation, his eyes wide with a gossipy curiosity as he stared at the infamous pistol. "What should I do with it, Sheriff?" John asked. "If you had any sense," Brody said, his gaze hard, "you'd take it to the deepest part of the river and drop it in. Some things are better left buried. A gun like this, it's not just a piece of steel, it's a key. And there are men in this world, powerful, dangerous men, who have been looking for the lock it opens for a very long time. You've just woken up the worst kind of history, son." John, against his better judgment but driven by a farmer's practicality, decided not to throw the gun away. It was a piece of history, after all. He wrapped it back up and tied it to his saddle. The advice was wise, but the idea of throwing away something so potentially valuable went against his nature. He rode home, the weight of the gun on his saddle seeming to grow with every mile. He felt a deep sense of foreboding, a feeling that the simple act of turning the soil had somehow broken a seal on a tomb that should have remained closed forever. He looked out at his peaceful, beautiful valley, and for the first time, it did not feel safe. It felt exposed, vulnerable. He did not know that the portly deputy, his mind buzzing with the most exciting story he had heard in years, was already in the telegraph office. He did not know that the story of the discovery of the serpent's tooth was, at that very moment, humming across the wires, a spark of electricity that was about to reignite a 20-year-old war. The quiet farmer had found a relic, and in doing so, had just painted a target on his home, his family, and his entire world. The peace of Serenity Valley was over. It just didn't know it yet. The telegraph wire was a spider's thread, and the news it carried was a venomous vibration, felt instantly in the darkest corners of the web. Within a week, the story of the farmer who found Silas Blackwood's legendary pistol had spread from the gossiping back rooms of dusty saloons to the opulent, smoke-filled studies of the territory's most powerful and ruthless men. For most, it was a curious piece of folklore, a ghost story resurrected. But for a select few, it was a summons. It was the tolling of a bell that had been silent for 2 decades. The first echo of the past to manifest was not a man, but a name: Judge Elias Thorne. The judge was the most powerful man in the territorial capital, a figure of immense wealth and political influence. He was known for his stern and yielding interpretation of the law, his vast land holdings, and his public persona as a pillar of civilization and progress. In his private study, a room lined with law books and expensive cigars, he read the telegram about the discovery of the serpent's tooth, and the mask of the civilized man slipped. His face, usually a controlled, patrician mask, tightened into something cold and predatory. Judge Thorne had been a young, ambitious lawyer 20 years ago, and the foundation of his vast fortune had been laid on the legal acquisition of lands once owned by the ranchers the Blackwood marauders had ruined. The second echo came from the south, from the sun-scorched badlands along the Mexican border. It came in the form of a man known only as Cain, a name he had earned for killing his own brother. Cain was now the aging but still lethally dangerous leader of a gang of gunrunners and bandits. He was a hard, sun-scorched man with eyes as dead and empty as a desert well. 20 years ago, he had been Silas Blackwood's right-hand man, the brutal hammer to Blackwood's cunning serpent. He heard the news from a drunken telegraph operator, and a slow, cruel smile, like a fissure in a rock face, spread across his lips. And so, the old wolves, long dormant, began to stir. They had been the 2 principal heirs to Blackwood's violent legacy. After the marauders had vanished, a secret, an easy truce had been struck. Thorne had used his legal cunning to secure the land and the political power, becoming a respectable baron. Cain had taken the gang's considerable fortune in gold and guns, carving out a criminal empire in the lawless territories. The serpent's tooth was the one piece of the puzzle neither of them possessed. The gun was more than a weapon, it was a symbol, and it was rumored to be the key to an even greater prize, the location of the marauders' legendary hidden cache of gold, a treasure that Silas Blackwood had supposedly buried before his disappearance. Back in Serenity Valley, John Carter was blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. He had listened to Sheriff Brody's warning, and to the deep, primal fear in his wife's heart. He had taken the cursed pistol, wrapped it once more in its oilcloth shroud, and locked it away in a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He tried to forget about it, to return to the simple, honest rhythm of his life. But the peace of the valley felt different now. It felt fragile, temporary. Every shadow seemed a little longer. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a faint, menacing whisper. Mary felt it too. She became watchful, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a rifle never far from her hand as she worked in her garden. The discovery had tainted their Eden, introduced the scent of the snake into their garden. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Sunday, a week after John's trip to Prosperity. They were just sitting down to their midday meal when through riders appeared on the ridge overlooking their farm. They were not ranchers or drifters. They were hard-faced men with rifles held casually across their saddles, and they sat their horses with the easy, arrogant posture of wolves sizing up a sheepfold. They didn't approach. They just watched. For a full hour, they sat there, a silent, menacing presence, before turning and riding away. John's blood ran cold. He knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that they were connected to the gun. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in a chair by the window, his old, reliable shotgun across his lap, his eyes scanning the moonlit yard. The next day, the psychological war began. He found one of his prize cows dead by the creek, its throat cut. There was no sign of a predator. It was a message, a deliberate act of cruelty designed to instill fear. A few days later, the small wooden bridge that crossed the river, their only quick route to prosperity, was burned. They were being isolated. The people of Serenity Valley, a small, tight-knit community of a dozen or so families, began to feel the pressure as well. Old Man Hemlock, whose farm bordered John's, found his fences cut and his cattle scattered. The Miller family, on the other side of the valley, had their well poisoned with a dead coyote, forcing them to haul water from the river. Fear, a thing that had been a stranger in the valley, began to take root. People started locking their doors at night. They looked at their neighbors with suspicion. Who had brought this trouble? The answer, in their fearful minds, was simple: John Carter. He was the one who had dug up the past. He was the one who had brought the curse upon them. The Carters, who had once been the heart of the community, now found themselves isolated, their neighbors too afraid to offer help or even a kind word. Sheriff Brody rode out from Prosperity, his face grim. "It's starting, John," he said, standing on the Carters' porch. "I've been hearing things. A man named Kane is moving north from the border with a dozen of the hardest cases you've ever seen. And a lawyer representing Judge Thorne has been in town, quietly buying up debt and land titles. They're circling you, son, like buzzards." "What can we do?" John asked, his voice tight. "I've sent a wire to the territorial marshals," Brody said, "but they're 100 miles away, and this is just a civil dispute so far. There's no proof of who's doing this. My advice: take Mary and Daniel, and ride out. Go west. Disappear. This valley is about to become a war zone. You can't win." That night, John and Mary had the most difficult conversation of their lives. "He's right, John," Mary said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is our home, but it's just land. It's just wood and dirt. Daniel is our life. We have to take him and go." John looked at her, at the fear and the strength in her eyes. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully in his small bed, oblivious to the monsters that were gathering at the edge of his world. Everything Sheriff Brody said was true. The logical, sensible thing to do was to run. But then he looked at his own hands. They were the hands of a builder, a farmer. They had built this house, tilled this soil. This land was not just property to him. It was a part of his soul. To run would be to let the evil win. It would be to teach his son that the only response to bullies and tyrants was to surrender. "No," John said, his voice quiet but filled with a new and yielding resolve. "This is our home. We are not running. This is where we make our stand." Mary looked at him, and though the fear was still in her eyes, a fierce pride shone through it. She took his hand. "Then we will stand together," she whispered. The next day, John Carter, the simple farmer, began to prepare for war. He rode out, not to his neighbors who had shunned him, but to the remote, isolated corners of the valley, to the people who had no one else to turn to. He went to the half-mad, grizzled old prospector who lived in the hills, a man who knew every cave and game trail. He went to a small, ostracized family of half-Comanche trackers who were feared by the other settlers. He was not just a farmer anymore. He was a leader, gathering the outcasts, the forgotten people, preparing to defend their shared home against the coming storm. The echoes of the past were growing louder, but the people of Serenity Valley were beginning to find an echo of their own, the quiet, stubborn resilience of a man with everything to lose. The first wave of the storm to break upon Serenity Valley was not a tide of physical violence, but a flood of legal paper. Judge Elias Thorne, a man who preferred the clean, bloodless execution of a contract to the messy reality of a gunfight, sent his agent, a weasel-faced lawyer named Fletcher, to do his dirty work. Fletcher set up an office in Prosperity and, with the financial backing of the judge, began a campaign of economic warfare. He bought the mortgage on the general store, the blacksmith shop, and, most importantly, on the farms of half the families in the valley. He immediately called in the debts. Men like Old Man Hemlock and the Miller family, who had lived for years on a delicate balance of credit and good faith, suddenly found themselves facing foreclosure and ruin. The offer was always the same. Fletcher would sit across the desk from a terrified farmer, a stack of legal documents between them, and make his proposition with a smug, reptilian smile. "Judge Thorne is a reasonable man," he would say. "He understands that times are hard. He is willing to forgive your debt entirely. All he asks in return is your small, insignificant piece of land. And, of course, your sworn testimony that your neighbor, John Carter, has been inciting unrest and threatening the peace of the community. It was a brilliant, cruel strategy. Thorne was not just trying to seize the land, he was trying to turn the valley against itself, to legally and socially isolate the Carters until they had no allies left. A few, desperate families, their livelihoods hanging by a thread, signed the papers, trading their integrity for survival. The community, which had already been fractured by fear, began to crumble under the weight of this new, insidious pressure. John Carter, watching his neighbors be picked off one by one, knew that time was running out. He had to give them a reason to fight, to show them that surrender was not the only option. He took the last of his own savings and rode to prosperity. He didn't go to the bank. He went to the office of the town's small, independent newspaper. He paid the editor to print a simple, one-page flyer. The flyer was a call to arms. It was not a fiery speech, but a simple, honest appeal from one farmer to another. It spoke of their shared home, of the sweat and sacrifice that had gone into building their lives in the valley. It named Judge Thorne and his agent Fletcher, exposing their scheme for the land grab that it was. And it ended with a simple declaration: they believe we are weak because we are farmers. They believe we are divided because we are poor. Let us show them that the roots of this community are deeper and stronger than their greed. Let us stand together. He and his few, alias the old prospector and the half-Comanche family, rode through the valley by night, leaving a copy of the flyer on the doorstep of every homestead. It was a small act of defiance, a single candle lit in the face of a gathering darkness. Meanwhile, the second wave of the storm was approaching from the south. Kane and his gang of hard cases were drawing near. They were not subtle. Their journey north was a trail of casual brutality. They rode into small towns, terrorizing the citizens, their reputation for violence preceding them like a foul wind. They were not just a gang, they were a small, mobile army, and their destination was Serenity Valley. John knew he could not defeat Kane's men in a straight-up gunfight. He was a farmer, not a general. His army consisted of a handful of outcasts. He had to use the one advantage he had, his intimate knowledge of the land. The valley was his home, and he would make it his fortress. He began to prepare. With the help of the old prospector, he scouted the narrow canyons and passes that were the only entrances to the valley. They planned deadfalls and rock slides, ways to turn the terrain itself into a weapon. The Comanche trackers, masters of stealth and ambush, taught John and the others how to move unseen, how to use the shadows and the landscape as camouflage. Mary, for her part, turned their homestead into a command center. She organized their meager supplies, stockpiling food, water, and ammunition. She became the heart of the resistance, her quiet, unshakable resolve a source of strength for them all. She also took charge of Daniel, keeping him safe and shielded from the worst of the fear, though the boy was old enough to know that something was deeply wrong. He watched his father, this quiet, gentle man, transform into a grim-faced leader, and a new, somber understanding began to dawn in his young eyes. The flyers had an effect, but not the one John had hoped for. Instead of a valley-wide uprising, it created a small, desperate faction of resistance. A half-dozen farmers, the ones with the most to lose and the deepest roots in the valley, finally chose a side. They rode to the Carter homestead, their faces grim, their old hunting rifles in their hands. They were not soldiers. They were fathers and husbands, terrified but resolute. "We ain't much, John," one of them, a stout man named Miller, said. "But this is our home. We ain't letting no fancy judge or border scum take it from us without a fight." John's small band of outcasts had grown into a small, desperate militia. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by the two-pronged attack of legal and physical force. But they were united by a common purpose. They were fighting for their homes. The first real battle was not one of bullets, but of wills. Fletcher, the lawyer, accompanied by a newly hired, thuggish town marshal and a posse of deputized men from the saloon, rode into the valley to serve an eviction notice on the Miller farm. They were met not by a single, terrified family, but by John Carter and his 10 armed farmers, positioned behind a hastily erected barricade of wagons and fence posts. "This is an illegal assembly," Fletcher sputtered, his face pale. You are obstructing the law. There's no law here but what's right, John called back, his voice steady, his shotgun held at the ready. You're not taking this farm today. Go back and tell your judge that the free men of Serenity Valley don't scare so easy. Fletcher, a coward at heart, was not prepared for armed resistance. After a tense standoff, he and his posse retreated, their threats and legal jargon ringing hollow in the face of the farmer's quiet and yielding resolve. It was a small victory, but a vital one. It was a taste of what they could accomplish if they stood together. It sent a message to Thorne that the valley would not simply roll over, and it bought them time. But they all knew it was just a temporary reprieve. Sheriff Brody sent a rider with a grim warning. Kane and his gang had been spotted less than a day's ride south. The legal maneuvering was over. The time for talking had passed. The real storm, the one of gunpowder and blood, was about to break. John Carter, the farmer, stood with his small band of neighbors, looking out at the peaceful valley he had sworn to protect. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood red. It was the last peaceful sunset Serenity Valley would see for a very long time. The choice was no longer about whether to fight, but how. John Carter, the reluctant leader, stood before his small, ragtag militia in the main room of his cabin. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil, sweat, and fear. Outside, a cold, nervous rain had begun to fall, a somber drumbeat counting down the hours until the inevitable confrontation. His fighters were a portrait of desperation. There were the farmers, their faces grim, their hands, more accustomed to a plow than a rifle, gripping their old weapons with a white-knuckled intensity. There was the old prospector, his eyes glinting with a wild, half-mad light, a brace of pistols tucked into his belt. And there was the half-Comanche familiar father and his two grown sons, insolent and watchful, their presence an unnerving blend of stillness and lethal potential. They were a handful of stubborn, frightened men, all that stood between Kane's approaching marauders and the homes they had sworn to protect. "They'll be here by morning," John said, his voice low and steady, his gaze moving from one man to the next. "Kane has at least 15 men, all of them seasoned killers. We are 10. The odds are not in our favor." A heavy silence filled the room. "We have the valley," said the Comanche father, his name Two Hawks. His voice was quiet but carried an undeniable authority. "This is our ground. We do not fight them in the open. We bleed them in the passes. We make the rocks and the trees our weapons." The plan they formulated was one of guerrilla warfare, a strategy born of necessity. They would not try to hold a single defensive line. They would be ghosts. They would use the deadfalls and traps they had prepared, striking at the head and the tail of Kane's column as it entered the narrow valley pass, then melting back into the hills they knew so well. It was a plan to turn their weakness in numbers into a strength, to use their knowledge of the land to sow chaos and fear among the invaders. As the men dispersed to their assigned positions, Mary approached John. She carried two gun belts. One was his familiar shotgun shell belt. The other was the ancient, serpent-tooled leather rig he had unearthed from the soil. The serpent's tooth, clean and oiled, rested in the holster. "No," John said, shaking his head. "I'm not him. I'm not Blackwood. I won't use that thing." The gun had become a symbol of the evil they were fighting, and he wanted no part of its dark legacy. "This isn't about who you are, John," Mary said, her voice fierce and insistent. "It's about what you need to be, just for one day. You need to be more than a farmer. You need to be a symbol for those men out there. They are following you, not just because you are a good man, but because you are the man who holds the key to this whole damn mess. This gun. It started this. It's only right that it should be the thing to finish it." She strapped the belt around his waist. The weight of it was alien, heavy with a history he did not want. But as his hand closed around the cold, obsidian grip, he felt a strange and welcome surge of power. The gun felt like it was made for his hand. It was a chilling, terrifying sensation. He was a farmer. But in that moment, holding that cursed pistol, he understood that he had to become a warrior. He kissed Mary, a long, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and farewell. He hugged his son, Daniel, holding him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, trying to burn the memory of this moment into his soul. "Be a brave boy for your mother," he whispered. "Are you going to fight the bad men, Pa?" Daniel asked, his voice small. "I am," John said, "so that you never have to." He walked out into the rain, the man transformed. He was no longer just John Carter. He was a husband, a father, and a leader, heading into a battle he did not choose, armed with a relic he did not want. He was a simple man who had been forced by circumstance to make a terrible choice, to become the very thing he despised in order to protect everything he loved. The battle for Serenity Valley began just after dawn, in the gray, misty half-light. Kane's marauders rode into the main pass with a swaggering, careless confidence. They were an ugly, brutal-looking bunch, the dregs of the borderlands. Kane himself rode at their head, a grim, implacable figure, his face a roadmap of old scars. They rode straight into the ambush. The first sign of trouble was a massive rockslide, triggered by the old prospector, that crashed down and sealed the pass behind them, trapping them in the narrow canyon. Before they could react, Rosalind and Deadly flew from the rocks above, the work of two hawks and his sons. Two of Kane's men fell from their saddles before a single gunshot had been fired. Chaos erupted. The marauders, caught completely by surprise, began firing wildly at the unseen enemy in the misty hills. John and his farmers, positioned on the opposite ridge, opened fire, their shots adding to the confusion. It was a perfect crossfire. Kane, a veteran of 100 such battles, reacted with a cold, professional fury. He roared at his men to take cover, to dismount and fight their way up the slopes. The battle devolved into a series of desperate, brutal skirmishes in the rocks and trees. John found himself in the heart of the fight, the old farmer's instincts giving way to a primal need to survive and protect. His shotgun was a brutal, effective weapon at close range. He fought not with skill, but with a raw, desperate courage that surprised even himself. He saw Miller, his neighbor, go down, a bullet in his chest. He saw one of the Comanche sons engaged in a deadly knife fight with a hulking marauder. The battle was a chaotic, swirling nightmare of noise, smoke, and death. Through it all, John pushed forward, his objective clear. This was not about killing all of them. This was about getting to the leader. This was about Kane. He saw him, directing his men from behind a large cluster of boulders. John broke cover, running through the open, his shotgun empty. He tossed it aside. A marauder saw him and raised his rifle. Before the man could fire, a shout rang out from John's hip. He hadn't even realized he had drawn the serpent's tooth. The ancient pistol bucked in his hand, its report a deep, throaty roar that was different from the other guns. The marauder spun and fell. John stared at the gun in his hand, at the wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. It had felt natural, easy. He shook off the chilling thought and continued his charge. He reached the boulders, vaulting over them, and came face to face with Kane. The two men stood, barely 10 feet apart, the leaders of two opposing worlds. Kane, the professional killer, the embodiment of the West's violent, predatory nature. And John, the farmer, the builder, the man who had been forced to become a warrior. Kane smiled, a cold, humorless expression. The farmer with the fancy gun, he sneered. I should have known Blackwood would have a soft air. He drew his own pistol with a speed that was a blur of motion. But John had already fired. The serpent's tooth roared again. The heavy-caliber slug caught Kane square in the chest, throwing him back against the rocks. He slid to the ground, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, his own gun discharging harmlessly into the sky. The death of their leader broke the last of the marauders' will to fight. Seeing Kane fall, they threw down their weapons and surrendered or fled back into the hills, where the Comanche trackers would hunt them down. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the pass, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the soft patter of the rain. John stood over Kane's body, the black, serpent-gripped pistol still smoking in his hand. He had done it. He had led his people. He had won. But as he looked at the carnage, at the bodies of his neighbors and his enemies lying together in the mud, he felt no triumph, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. The farmer had made his choice, and the price had been paid in blood. The victory in the pass was a bloody, desperate affair, but it was a victory nonetheless. The immediate threat of Kane's marauders had been broken. John Carter and his small militia returned to their homes not as triumphant heroes, but as weary, wounded men who had been forced to look into the abyss. They had lost two of their own, including John's neighbor, Miller, and the weight of those deaths lay heavy on them all. They had proven that the people of Serenity Valley would not be broken by force, but a chilling realization settled over them. This was only the beginning. The news of Kane's death and the defeat of his gang reached Judge Elias Thorne in the territorial capital via a frantic telegram from his agent, Fletcher. The judge, sitting in his leather-backed chair, surrounded by the trappings of his respectable life, did not fly into a rage. His reaction was far more terrifying. A cold, reptilian stillness came over him. His plan of a simple, overwhelming show of force had failed. The farmer had proven to be a surprisingly resilient and resourceful opponent. Thorne realized his mistake. He had underestimated the power of a man defending his home. He had also underestimated the symbolic power of the gun. The news that John Carter had personally killed Kane with the serpent's tooth sent a chill down his spine. It was as if the ghost of Silas Blackwood, his old, secret partner, was rising from the grave, and the farmer was its chosen vessel. The judge knew he could no longer rely on proxies and deniable thugs. Kane's gang was scattered. Fletcher's legal maneuvers were useless against armed men. If he wanted the valley and the secrets it held, he would need a new, more formidable weapon. He would have to form an alliance with the only other man in the territory who had a stake in this game, and who was as ruthless and as desperate as he was. His telegram went south, not to the border, but to a different kind of hellhole, the Yuma Territorial Prison. It was addressed to the warden, a man who, like so many others, was in Thorne's debt. The message was simple and cryptic: prepare prisoner 730 for early release. A full pardon is being arranged. Prisoner 734 was a man named Jedediah Jed Stone, though no one had called him that in 20 years. In the brutal, sun-scorched world of Yuma, he was known only as the Jackal. He was a former member of the Blackwood Marauders, Silas Blackwood's chief strategist and second-in-command. A man whose cunning was as legendary as Blackwood's cruelty and Kane's brutality. He had been the only member of the gang ever to be captured, brought down years after their disappearance on an unrelated charge. He had kept his silence for 2 decades, a man nursing a deep and bitter grudge against the world, particularly against the partners who had left him to rot while they had gone on to build their own empires. The Jackal was brought from his cell to the warden's office. He was a scarecrow of a man now, his hair completely white, his skin a pale, prison gray, but his eyes, a startlingly bright and intelligent blue, burned with an undiminished fire. He listened as the warden explained the judge's offer, a full pardon and a small fortune in gold in exchange for one last job. The job, the warden explained, is to retrieve a certain piece of property from a farmer in Serenity Valley, and to eliminate the farmer and any who stand with him. The judge requires a man with a particular set of skills, a man who understands the history of the region. A slow, predatory smile spread across the Jackal's thin lips. He knew exactly what property the judge was talking about, and he knew that this was his chance, not just for freedom, but for revenge he had been dreaming of for 20 years. Tell the judge, the Jackal said, his voice a dry and used rasp, that I accept his offer. But my price is not gold. It is the valley itself. When I am done, Serenity Valley, and everything in it, will be mine. And one more thing, his bright, cold eyes seemed to bore into the warden's soul. I will need to assemble a new team. The best. Money is no object. Back in Serenity Valley, a tense and easy peace had settled. The farmers had returned to their fields, but they worked with rifles slung over their shoulders. They had buried their dead, but the ghosts of the battle haunted them. John Carter, the reluctant hero, found himself in a role he had never wanted. He was now the de facto leader of the valley's defense, the man everyone looked to for answers. The serpent's tooth, the cursed pistol, now rested on his mantelpiece, a constant, silent reminder of the violence he had been forced to commit. He hated the weapon, but he could not bring himself to get rid of it. It was a part of him now, a symbol of the terrible choice he had made. Mary saw the change in him. The quiet, gentle farmer was still there, but he was now overlaid with a new, harder persona, a man who looked at the horizon not with hope, but with a constant, weary vigilance. Sheriff Brody rode out from Prosperity with a new, grim warning. It's not over, John, he said, his old face etched with worry. The marshals are finally on their way, but Thorne is a powerful man. He's petitioning the governor, claiming the valley is in a state of armed insurrection. He's twisting the story, painting you as the villain," he sighed, taking off his hat and wiping his brow. "And there's more. I've been hearing whispers. The kind of whispers that turn a man's blood to ice. They're talking about Yuma. They're saying the judge has pulled strings and let the jackal out of his cage." John had never heard the name, but he saw the fear in Brody's eyes. "Jedediah Stone," Brody explained, "was the brains of the Blackwood Marauders. Silas was the face, Cain was the muscle, but the jackal, he was the poison. He never fought a battle he hadn't already won in his head. If he's coming here, John, he's not just bringing guns. He's bringing hell with him." The news settled over the valley like a funeral shroud. They had defeated the brute force of Cain. But now they faced a different kind of enemy, a master tactician, a man with the backing of the territory's most powerful judge. And he was not just a hired gun, he had a personal, historical stake in this fight. The unholy alliance of the politician and the strategist had been forged. The war for Serenity Valley was about to enter a new, far deadlier phase. John Carter looked at the faces of his wife, his son, and his weary neighbors. His choice to stand and fight had saved them once. Now, he had to wonder if that same choice had doomed them all. Jedediah the Jackal Stone did not descend upon Serenity Valley with the brutish, head-on charge of Cain. It was slow, insidious, and it targeted the soul of the valley before its body. The Jackal was a master of psychological warfare, and his first move was not to attack the farmers, but to recruit their enemies from within. He arrived in Prosperity not with a gang of dusty outlaws, but with a small, elite cadre of hired guns, each a specialist in a particular brand of violence. There was a silent, knife-wielding Apache scout, a demolitions expert from the silver mines, and a cold-eyed, professional sniper. He set up his base of operations in the town, and with Judge Thorne's money as his weapon, he began to turn Prosperity into a hostile camp, effectively surrounding Serenity Valley. His first target was Fletcher, the judge's weasel-faced lawyer. Fletcher had been hiding in his office, terrified of the farmer's retribution. The Jackal paid him a visit. He didn't threaten. He simply sat across from the lawyer, his pale, intelligent eyes dissecting the man, and he made him an offer. "You failed the judge because you are a coward who relies on paper," the Jackal said, his voice a dry rasp. "I, on the other hand, succeed because I understand that fear is the only contract that is never breached. You will continue your legal work, but you will do it my way. You will find every disgruntled, greedy, and cowardly man in this region, and you will offer them a share of the valley's spoils in exchange for their service to me." Under the Jackal's cold, commanding presence, Fletcher became a far more effective tool. He began to assemble a small army of local thugs, resentful drifters, and saloon toughsmen who were promised land and money once the rebellious farmers of Serenity Valley were crushed. The Jackal was building a private army, giving them a legal banner to march under, supplied by the judge's wealth. His next move was to sow discord and terror within the valley itself. He didn't use brute force. He used whispers and shadows. The Apache scout began to move through the valley at night, a phantom leaving signs of his presence. A farmer would wake to find a dead hawk, its wings spread, nailed to his barn door, symbol of a watcher in the sky. Another would find a single, black arrow buried in his porch railing. These were not direct attacks, but acts of psychological terrorism, designed to fray the nerves of the already terrified farmers, to make them feel watched, hunted, and unsafe even in their own homes. John Carter and his small band of defenders felt the shift immediately. The open defiance they had shown after the battle in the past gave way to a grim, defensive crouch. They were no longer just watching the passes, they were watching their own backyards. The unity that had been forged in the first battle began to show cracks under this new, relentless pressure. Men grew tired, their nerves worn raw by the constant, unseen threat. Arguments broke out. The simple farmers were not soldiers, and they were not prepared for a war of attrition. John knew he had to do something to counter the Jackal's insidious strategy. He couldn't just sit and wait for the final attack. He had to take the fight to the enemy. He had to show them that the valley was not a passive victim. His chance came when he learned from Sheriff Brody that a large wagon train of new, repeating rifles and ammunition, paid for by Judge Thorne, was due to arrive in Prosperity to arm the Jackal's growing army. This was the true threat. If those guns reached his men, the valley was doomed. John devised a plan that was both daring and desperate. He would not try to attack the wagon train on the open road. It would be too heavily guarded. He would hit the snake in its nest. He would conduct a raid on Prosperity itself to intercept and destroy the weapons before they could be distributed. It was a suicide mission, and he knew it. He presented the plan to his small militia. "I won't order any of you to go," he said, his face grim in the lamplight of his barn. "This is a straight-up fight in their territory. The odds are long, but if we let those guns get into their hands, there won't be another fight. There will only be a slaughter." To his surprise, every man volunteered. The Jackal's campaign of terror had backfired. Instead of breaking them, it had hardened their resolve, burning away their fear and leaving a core of cold, defiant anger. The raid was a masterpiece of guerrilla tactics, a plan worthy of the Jackal himself. Two hawks and his son slipped into Prosperity the night before, moving like shadows, mapping the town's layout and the positions of the Jackal's sentries. The old prospector, using his knowledge of mining, was tasked with creating a diversion. The attack began an hour before dawn. The prospector set off a series of small, controlled dynamite charges at the far end of town, near the livery stable, creating the illusion of a full-scale assault. As the Jackal's main force rushed to meet the perceived threat, John and his 10 farmers, their faces darkened with soot, attacked from the opposite direction. Their target, the heavily guarded warehouse where the arms shipment was being stored. The fight at the warehouse was a short, brutal, and bloody affair. John and his men, fueled by a desperate courage, overwhelmed the small contingent of guards left behind. They were not fighting for money, they were fighting for their children's lives, and it gave them a ferocity that the hired guns could not match. They did not try to steal the weapons. Their goal was destruction. They smashed the rifle crates, poured coal oil over everything, and set the warehouse ablaze. Within minutes, the building was a roaring inferno, the ammunition inside cooking off in a chaotic, terrifying fireworks display of its own. They retreated as quickly as they had come, melting back into the darkness just as the Jackal, realizing he had been duped, arrived with his main force. He was too late. He stood there, his face a mask of cold fury, watching his new, expensive arsenal go up in smoke. The raid was a stunning success. John and his men had struck a major blow against their enemy, destroying his supplies and, more importantly, shattering his aura of invincibility. They had lost 1 man in the raid, but they had won a major victory. But as they rode back to the valley, the first light of dawn illuminating their tired, smoke-stained faces, John felt no elation. He knew what he had done. He had not just won a battle, he had issued a personal challenge. He had met the Jackal's strategic gambit with one of his own. This was no longer a simple fight for land. It had become a personal duel between 2 master tacticians, the farmer and the Jackal. And John knew, with a chilling certainty, that the next move from his opponent would be even more cunning, and far more deadly. The serpent in the soil had been replaced by a Jackal at the door, and the final, bloody phase of the war was about to begin. The burning of the armory in Prosperity was a public humiliation for the Jackal, and a far more painful wound to his pride than the loss of the weapons themselves. He, the master strategist, had been outmaneuvered by a common farmer. The cold, analytical mind that had languished in a Yuma prison cell for 20 years was now fully engaged, and it was focused with a laser-like intensity on the complete and utter destruction of John Carter and everything he held dear. The Jackal understood that John's strength was not in his tactical skill, but in his motivation. He was a man fighting for his home, his family, his community. To defeat him, the Jackal knew he had to take those things away. He had to poison the well of Carter's support, to turn the very people he was protecting against him. His new strategy was one of pure, unadulterated terror, but it was a targeted, surgical terror. He sent his Apache scout and his sniper into the valley, not to leave warnings, but to collect a bloody toll. Over the next week, 2 of the farmers who had fought alongside John were picked off by a sniper's bullet while working their fields. They were shot from an impossible distance, a single, clean shot that left no trail, only a dead body and a fresh wave of terror. The message was clear. To stand with John Carter was to sign your own death warrant. The resolve of the valley's defenders began to crumble. They were brave men, but they were not soldiers. They could not protect their families and watch their fields if they had to worry about a phantom bullet from a distant ridge. One by one, They came to John, their faces etched with shame and sorrow. "We can't, John," old man Hemlock told him, his voice breaking. "I've got a wife and grandkids. I can't leave them unprotected. We're out." John could not blame them. He saw their fear, and he knew it was justified. His small army dissolved, melting back to their own homesteads, leaving him and his few original alias Prospector and the Comanche familia once again isolated and alone. With John's support network shattered, the Jackal made his next move. It was a gambit of such audacious cruelty that even Judge Thorne, when he heard of it, felt a flicker of unease. The Jackal sent a lone rider to the Carter homestead under a flag of truce. The rider carried a message. It was not a threat. It was a bargain. John met the rider in his yard, his hand never far from the serpent's tooth on his hip. The message was simple. The Jackal offered a permanent truce. The attacks on the valley would stop. The legal challenges would be dropped. The people of Serenity Valley would be left in peace. In exchange for this, the Jackal demanded only two things. First, the serpent's tooth. And second, John Carter's son, Daniel. The proposal was monstrous. The boy would not be harmed, the message assured. He would be taken as a ward of Judge Thorne, to be raised and educated in the territorial capital, a guest to ensure the valley's continued good behavior. He would be a hostage, a permanent piece of leverage to hold over the valley's head. John tore the message to pieces, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. He sent the rider back with a simple, profane refusal. But the seed had been planted. The Jackal, anticipating the refusal, had made sure the contents of his bargain were leaked to the rest of the valley. And it worked exactly as he had planned. A delegation of the remaining farmers, led by Hemlock, rode to John's farm that evening. They were not carrying rifles. They were wringing their hats in their hands, their faces a portrait of desperate, terrified anguish. "John," Hemlock began, his voice trembling, "we know it's an unthinkable thing he's asking, but you have to consider it. It's one boy. For the safety of the whole valley. For all our children." John stared at them, at the faces of the men he had fought beside, and he felt a betrayal so profound it was like a physical blow. "You would have me sell my son?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "It's not like that," another farmer pleaded. "He said the boy wouldn't be harmed. He'd be educated, have a better life than any of us could give him." They were rationalizing the monstrous, twisting it into a sensible, pragmatic solution. The Jackal's poison had worked. He had found their breaking point. It was not their own lives they were afraid to lose, but the lives of their children. And they were willing to sacrifice John's child to save their own. John ordered them off his land, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He had fought to save his community, and that same community was now asking him to sacrifice his own son on the altar of their fear. He was utterly, completely alone. That night, as he sat on his porch, the weight of the world on his shoulders, Mary came to him. She had heard the conversation. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and hard. "They've left you no choice, John," she said softly. "I will never give them our son," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she said. "That's why there is only one choice left. You can't win this war. You can't protect the whole valley. But you can protect our family." She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sheriff Brody was right from the beginning. We have to run. Tonight. We will take Daniel and we will ride west, and we will never look back." He looked at her, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes. He looked at his home, the land he had bled for, the community he had tried to save. To run felt like a coward's choice, a betrayal of everything he had fought for. But to stay was to risk his son's life, to offer him up to the very evil he was fighting. And in that moment of terrible clarity, John Carter, the farmer, the warrior, the leader, made his final choice. He would not be a hero. He would not be a martyr. He would be a father. "Get Daniel ready," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Pack what you can. We ride in an hour." As Mary rushed inside, John walked to the fireplace. He took the serpent's tooth from the mantelpiece. This cursed object was the source of all their misery. It was the key to the treasure that Thorne and the Jackal so desperately wanted. Without it, perhaps they would have no reason to hunt him to the ends of the earth. He took the gun to his forge. He fired up the bellows, the flames roaring to life. He laid the ancient pistol, the symbol of Silas Blackwood's evil, directly into the heart of the fire. He watched as the obsidian grips cracked in the heat, as the black steel began to glow a dull, angry red. He was not just destroying a gun. He was destroying a part of himself, the part that had become a killer. He was choosing to be a farmer once more, a husband, a father. With the gun melting in the fire, he made his final preparations. He was leaving his home, his land, his life behind, but he was taking his family. And in the end, he knew that was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The serpent's bargain had been refused, and now all that was left was flight. The escape was an act of desperate, heartbreaking finality. John, Mary, and a sleeping Daniel, wrapped tightly in a blanket, slipped out of their home under the cover of a moonless, starless night. Every creak of saddle leather, every nervous snort from their horses, sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. John took one last look at the dark, silent shape of his cabin, the fields he had tilled, the barn he had raised. It was a silent, painful amputation, cutting away a part of his soul. They did not take the main road. Two Hawks and his sons, loyal to the end, guided them through a series of forgotten, treacherous game trails that wound their way through the high country, a route that would be invisible to any pursuers. The old prospector had stayed behind, promising to create a diversion, to lead any initial search party on a wild goose chase to the south. It was a selfless, suicidal act, and John knew he would likely never see the grizzled old man again. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing themselves and their horses to the brink of exhaustion. They spoke little, they shared, and spoke in grief, a heavy blanket between them. John was a man hollowed out by defeat. He had stood his ground, he had fought, he had won the battles, but he had lost the war. He had been defeated not by bullets, but by the insidious poison of fear that had turned his own community against him. On the third day, as they crested a high ridge that gave them a final, panoramic view of Serenity Valley miles behind them, they saw the smoke. It was not the smoke of a single cabin, but a dozen thick, black columns rising into the clear blue sky. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his small voice filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. John didn't have to answer. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, what he was seeing. The jackal, enraged at their escape and at the destruction of the gun he so coveted, had unleashed his fury. He had been denied his prize, so he was burning the vault. The homes of the farmers who had abandoned John, who had tried to bargain with the devil for their safety, were now being consumed by his fire. The jackal was not a man of his word. He was a creature of pure, nihilistic destruction. They made their choice, Mary whispered, her voice a mixture of sorrow and a cold, hard anger. And now they are paying for it. A new, terrible resolve hardened in John's heart. He had tried to be a father, to save his family by running. But as he looked at the smoke, at the destruction of his home, he knew there was no running. And evil like the jackal, like Judge Thorne, would not stop. They would hunt him to the ends of the earth, not just for the legend of the gold, but for the simple, arrogant fact that he had defied them. To run was only to delay the inevitable, to live a life looking over his shoulder, to raise his son in a world of fear. He had destroyed the gun, the symbol of the warrior he had been forced to become. But he realized now that the power had not been in the gun. It had been in the choice to stand and fight. And he had to make that choice again. "We're going back," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "John, no," Mary cried, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't. It's over." "It's not over," he said, turning his horse around. He looked at her, and she saw in his face that the farmer was gone for good, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "It's not over until I say it's over. You take Daniel. Ride for Fort Union. It's the only place with enough federal troops to be safe from Thorne. Do not stop. Do not look back. I will find you there. I promise." "What are you going to do?" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to finish this," he said. He looked at Two Hawks and his sons. "My fight is not yours. Take my family. Protect them. I will be in your debt forever." The old Comanche tracker looked at the burning valley, and then at the cold fire in John's eyes. He gave a single, solemn nod. The parting was the hardest thing John had ever done. He hugged his son, his heart breaking. He kissed his wife, a final, desperate kiss that was both a promise and a farewell. Then he watched them ride west, a small, lonely party of refugees, until they were just specks on the horizon. When they were gone, he was truly alone. He turned his horse and began the journey back to Serenity Valley. He was no longer a farmer or leader. He was an executioner. He had no gun, no army, no home. He had only a promise to keep, and a singular, all-consuming purpose, to hunt down and destroy the men who had taken his world from him. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that, he now knew, was the most dangerous kind of man of all. John Carter returned to Serenity Valley not as a resident, but as a ghost. The valley he had loved was a smoldering ruin. The farmhouses were blackened, skeletal remains, the fields trampled, the livestock scattered or killed. The jackal, in his rage, had been furrow. The few surviving families had fled, becoming refugees on the open plains. The valley was a tomb, populated only by the ghosts of a once peaceful life and the victorious, arrogant army of the jackal. John was no longer a farmer defending his home. He was an insurgency of one. He melted into the high country, the familiar hills and canyons becoming his sanctuary and his hunting ground. He was a man transformed, his grief and loss burned away, leaving a core of pure, cold, tactical rage. He began a one-man war, not of open battle, but of terror and attrition. His first targets were the patrols that the jackals sent out to scour the valley. John, guided by the deep, instinctual knowledge of the land, became a phantom. He used the terrain, his old farming tools, and a brutal, cunning ingenuity. A patrol would ride into a narrow, wooded canyon and find their path blocked by a massive, felled tree. As they struggled to turn their horses around in the confined space, heavy, sharpened logs, released from the canyon rim above, would swing down like massive pendulums, sifting men from their saddles. There would be no gunshots, only the splintering of wood and the screams of men, and then a terrible silence. He raided their camps at night, a silent, deadly wraith. He would slit the throat of a sentry, poison their water supply with noxious roots, and set their horses stampeding into the darkness, leaving them stranded, terrified, and on foot. He was not fighting a war for land anymore. He was fighting a war of the mind, dismantling the jackal's army by systematically destroying their morale. The hired guns, who had signed on for an easy fight against farmers, found themselves being hunted by a relentless, unseen demon. They were professional killers, but they were not prepared for this kind of warfare. They were used to facing a man with a gun, not a ghost who used the land itself as a weapon. They began to desert, slipping away in the night, preferring to face the devil they knew on the open trail than the one they didn't in this haunted, cursed valley. The jackal, secure in his command post in the now fortified town of Prosperity, grew increasingly enraged and frustrated. He had won. He had taken the valley, but he could not control it. His men were terrified, his authority was being undermined, and the farmer, the one man he needed to eliminate, was an intangible, ever-present threat. He was a king ruling over a kingdom of ash and fear, and the ghost of John Carter was the specter at his feast. He knew he had to draw John out, to force him into a final, open confrontation. And he knew that the only bait that could possibly work was John's family. He sent riders, not into the valley, but west, on the trail to Fort Union, with orders to capture Mary and Daniel at any cost. But he had underestimated the loyalty John Carter had inspired. Sheriff Brody, who had been secretly monitoring the jackal's movements, got word of the plan. He sent his fastest rider, a young, brave deputy, to intercept them. The deputy rode himself and two horses to death, but he reached Two Hawks and the Carter family just hours ahead of the jackal's pursuing posse. Warrened, Two Hawks led them off the main trail, into the labyrinthine Badlands, a place where his people had hidden from their enemies for generations. The jackal's men, unused to the terrain, were lost in a maze of canyons and false trails, their pursuit a frustrating and fruitless exercise. Mary and Daniel were safe. The news of the failed capture, and of his dwindling, terrified forces, finally broke the jackal's cold, analytical control. He realized he could not win this war of shadows. He had to end it, now. He made a final, desperate gambit. He sent a message to the one man who could end this, Judge Elias Thorne. The telegram was blunt: "The valley is lost. Your etched is a ghost I cannot catch." Your entire enterprise is about to collapse under the weight of a federal investigation Brody has instigated. There is only one play left. Come to Prosperity. Bring everything you have. We will lure him here and finish it, or we will all hang together. It was an ultimatum. Judge Thorne, seeing his respectable world about to crumble, his web of corruption on the verge of being exposed, had no choice. He called in his last, most powerful markers. He gathered a private army of mercenaries, the best guns money could buy, and he boarded a private train. His destination, Prosperity. He was no longer a distant, respectable politician. He was a warlord, riding to his last stand. Sheriff Brody got word of the judge's movements and knew the final battle was at hand. He sent one last rider to find John, a desperate plea for him to get out, to save himself. The rider found John in a high mountain pass, a gaunt, bearded wild man, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He gave him the sheriff's message. John listened, his face an unreadable mask. He looked west, in the direction his family had gone. He had a choice. He could ride after them, fulfill his promise, and disappear, leaving Thorne and the Jackal to their fate. Or he could turn back, to face a private army, to certain death, on the slim chance that he could end this threat to his family forever. He thought of Daniel, growing up in a world where men like Thorne and the Jackal held power, where they could hunt his family for the rest of their lives. He thought of his promise to his son, to fight the bad men so that he would never have to. The choice was clear. It had always been clear. Tell Sheriff Brody, John Carter said to the rider, his voice the quiet, resolute sound of a man who had made his peace with his own mortality, that I'll be there. The final confrontation for the soul of Serenity Valley did not happen in the valley itself. It happened in the dusty, corrupted streets of Prosperity. The town had become an armed camp, the hastily assembled mercenary army of Judge Thorne patrolling the streets, their faces hard, and their guns ready. They were professionals, a far deadlier force than Kane's thugs or the Jackal's drifters. Judge Thorne and the Jackal had made the saloon their headquarters. They were cornered, desperate men, their unholy alliance now a bond of mutual, impending doom. They knew John Carter was coming, not because they had tracked him, but because a man like Carter, a man who had sacrificed everything, would not leave a job half-finished. They had made the town a fortress, a massive, painted trap, and they waited. They did not have to wait long. On a hot, still afternoon, a lone rider appeared at the end of the main street. It was Sheriff Brody. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the center of town, his old badge glinting in the sun. He was met by a dozen rifles. I have a message for Judge Thorne, Brody announced, his voice carrying the unshakable authority of a lifetime of law. From John Carter. He agrees to your meeting. He will face you, but not in this armed camp. He will not be ambushed. He will meet you, alone at sunrise, at his old homestead. Just you, and the Jackal. If you do not agree, he will continue to bleed you, one man at a time, until there are none of you left. He has nothing to lose. You have everything. It was a brilliant, audacious move. Brody had turned their trap inside out, using John's terrifying reputation to force them to meet on his ground. Thorne and the Jackal, after a bitter argument, had no choice but to agree. To refuse would be to admit their fear, to lose the respect of the very men they had hired to protect them. The next morning, the sun rose on the blackened, skeletal ruins of the Carter homestead. The air was still and cool. In the center of what had once been his front yard, John Carter stood waiting. He was unarmed, save for a simple farmer's scythe that he held loosely in one hand. Two riders appeared on the ridge, Judge Thorne and the Jackal. They were armed with pistols and rifles, their confidence restored by the sight of their lone, seemingly helpless enemy. They dismounted and approached him, their expressions a mixture of triumph and contempt. The fool actually came, Thorne sneered. Your reign of terror is over, farmer. This is not a surrender, John said, his voice calm, his gaze fixed on them. This is a final accounting. The Jackal, his bright, intelligent eyes scanning the ruins, felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease. This was too easy. The farmer was a tactician. This was a trap. Where is the gun, Carter? The Jackal asked, his voice sharp. The serpent's tooth. I destroyed it, John said simply. The past should stay buried. A sentimental fool, Thorne spat, raising his rifle. And it was then that the trap was sprung. From the ruins of the burned-out barn, from the ditch by the creek, from the skeletal remains of the house itself, figures began to rise. It was Sheriff Brody and a dozen deputies, their rifles all trained on the two men. But they were not alone. Rising with them were two hawks and his sons, their bows drawn taut, and rising from a shallow trench, where they had lain hidden all night, were a dozen grim-faced men in the blue uniforms of the United States Marshals. Brody had done more than just deliver a message. He had used the time to bring the full weight of the law to bear. Thorne's political influence had finally been overridden by the sheer scale of his crimes. Thorne and the Jackal were caught, completely and utterly surrounded. The Jackal, a bitter, ironic smile on his face, slowly raised his hands. He was a survivor. He knew when a game was lost. But Judge Thorne, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, was not a survivor. He was a king whose kingdom had just crumbled. He refused to be taken. He let out a primal scream of fury and swung his rifle toward John. He never fired a shot. A half-dozen rifles roared at once. The judge was thrown backward, his body torn apart by a volley of righteous lead, his final act of defiance a futile, bloody gesture. The Jackal was taken in chains, his brilliant mind now destined to contemplate the four walls of a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. In the aftermath, as the marshals secured the scene, John Carter stood alone, the scythe still in his hand. It was over. The war was won. The law had finally prevailed. The story does not end with a triumphant return. John Carter did not rebuild his farm. The memories were too painful, the soil too soaked in blood. The territory, in gratitude, granted him a large, prosperous tract of land in a new, peaceful valley to the west. He sent for Mary and Daniel, and they started over, building a new life, a new home, far from the ghosts of Serenity Valley. But he was a changed man. The quiet, simple farmer was gone forever, replaced by a man with a deep, abiding sadness in his eyes, a man who understood the terrible price of peace. He would often stand at the edge of his new fields, his gaze distant, and his hand would unconsciously trace the shape of a pistol grip at his side, a phantom limb from a life he could never entirely leave behind. The open ending is not in the battle, but in the man. The smoke cleared, and the land was his, but the peace he had fought for was a thing he himself could never truly possess again. He was a hero, a legend, but he was also a casualty of the war he had won, a simple farmer who had been forced to learn that some furrows, once plowed, can never be smoothed over.